and gentlemen, good evening. Before we get started, may I kindly request everybody to switch their cell phones to the silent mode? This evening, the University of Liberal Arts Bangladesh is proud to host Canadian author, essayist, and president of PEN International, John Ralston Saul. As an essayist, Saul is particularly known for his commentaries on the nature of individualism, citizenship and the public good, the failures of manager-led societies, military strategy, in particular irregular warfare, the role of freedom of speech and culture, and his critique of contemporary economic arguments. He has written several novels, including The Birds of Prey, Baraka, The Next Best Thing, and The Paradise Eater. I would now like to request the Honorable Vice President of the ULAB Board of Trustees, Dr. Qazi Anis Ahmed, to come up on stage for his welcome speech. Please welcome Dr. Qazi Anis Ahmed.
Thank you for coming out for this talk. Apologies first that we are starting a little late, but we're delighted that we have today with us John Ralston Saul, who is the current president of PEN International. I actually just looked this up and I wasn't aware of this. These 3 days that we've had a chance to meet him, or all these years that I've known of his reputation, I did not know this. If I'm not mistaken, you're the first or only North American to have held this office since Arthur Miller. So he's clearly a person of rare persuasive qualities, because the office he holds is an elected one. And I happened to learn recently that he was elected mostly by votes not by North Americans or the Europeans. He was really a candidate of voters, that is writers from around the world. So he really is a man of the globe, and his focus is global issues that are concerns for all of us. Our MC today has already given you the sort of official bio of his, especially in his capacity as a writer. I will take just a couple of minutes to situate today's talk in a philosophical context from our vantage, and then yield the stage to John. As we all know, we humans have spent centuries or millennia praying to the gods. A very interesting shift happened post-Renaissance, and especially post-Enlightenment and the post-industrial era. Although it is not something that originated in these times, which is the raising of a new deity, the deity of reason. Reason itself has its own deep heritage or pedigree going back to several early civilizations, not only the ones that are now most prominent, meaning, say, Greek philosophy or Indian philosophy, but other philosophies as well. But there has also been an ascendancy of reason and a dominance of reason in thinking and in how thoughts then get transferred or feed into policy making, and therefore how we organize ourselves as societies. But there's also been always a counter movement to this kind of thinking. Now, there's a problem with critique of reason, because it can easily get mistaken or misunderstood for a championing of a more atavistic form of thinking, that we may be promoting or that someone might be making excuses for blind faith or irration. To critique reason is definitely not to say that we prefer the abandonment of reason, or to say that we want a return to irrational thinking. To critique reason is to say that we need to start recognizing more properly the aspects of reason and more properly the areas of its application. And reason is one of several vital human faculties, but it is not the only one. We also have intuition, imagination, ethics, and other capabilities which don't necessarily stem directly from reason, but complement it in very, very critical ways. And one of the most important ones, John has written about them in his book on equilibrium, and John has been at the forefront of the latest phase of the critique of reason with his book of philosophy, Voltaire's Bastards, which came out in the early 90s. And there's been a number of books since then in which he has tried to fill out the theory so that it is not only a critique, but also a proposal of where we should be moving and what kind of thinking we should move to. I personally feel that where we have seen a serious deficit, so this idea of reason and how we have used it to organize ourselves as societies, to organize people on a mass scale, has found many expressions. Interestingly enough, both communism and capitalism are expressions of societies over-reliant on reason as opposed to other qualities, and thinking that rationally ordained vectors will lead to all good outcomes automatically. We are now living in a world in the aftermath of a new ascendancy of that kind of over-reliance on reason and particular expressions of it, namely a neoliberal globalizing order of the last 2.5 decades. And John, along with a number of critiques, is at the forefront of pointing out its deficits. And one of the great deficits of this era has been compassion. I was very fortunate as an undergraduate student to study with one of the great philosophers of our time, Martha Nussbaum, who has in particular written very eloquently about it, and in particular a seminal book, The Fragility of Goodness, and in other books. She's someone who also collaborated with Amartya Sen and other authors, where they have very convincingly talked about the importance of compassion and imagination as the primary platforms for being able to get to ethics. Ethics is not something that you can get to only with reason, only through deductive or even inductive reasoning as a matter of calculating goods. There is something that sometimes requires a certain kind of leap. So in this context, it's a great privilege for us to have one of not only the great thinkers, but one of the great activists of our time who wants to keep open the space of thinking. And within this broad scope of how the global commons have been shrinking, the spaces of compassionate thinking has been shrinking, one of the surprises for this decade also has been technology, which was supposed to set us free, has also become a very effective tool against freedom. So since we have John Saul on hand, and since some people who are also present here today, I'm sure, have already had a chance to hear him speak on freedom of expression at the Hay Festival recently concluded, we wanted to hear from him a bit more on this particular challenge of our times, the rise of technology, and also how it is actually helping authoritarianism. I should clarify that while the title of the talk today is Technology and the Rise of Authoritarianism, we're not proposing that this is what should happen. This is an iteration of what we see happening around the world, and we would love to hear from John Saul, his thoughts on why or how it's happening, and how do we, as individuals, as readers, as writers, as citizens in society, become active and engaged again and use tools like technology to our advantage to the purpose of freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, my great pleasure and honor to introduce our guest for today, the current president of PEN International, John Ralston Saul. Thank you.
Anis, thank you very much, and Judith, thank you for having me here. That was a wonderful introduction. Done part of my work. This is good. Let me say two things right away. First, that we've been subjected, all of us, no matter what age you are, we've been subjected to the idea that not only is rationality dominant and essential, but that if we don't embrace it, interesting enough, embrace it unthinkingly, even though it's supposed to be about thinking, that we're embracing irrationality. When, of course, all languages offer several ways of saying it. If you don't simply embrace reason, there are other options than irrationality. You might say non-rational, non-reason. And as Anise has been saying, I wrote in a book, which is sort of the fourth volume of a long argument that started with Voltaire's Bastards. I wrote in On Equilibrium a very simple idea, which you could call in the Socratic tradition, saying, you know, there are probably 6 human qualities of equal value, and these are qualities which directly or indirectly enable us to do things, to act, to be. The book was simply going through common sense, ethics, intuition, memory, and I've forgotten one now, that's the traffic, and rationality. And of course, you know, what we've been all educated to think everywhere in the world because of the power of the empires, which the European empires that brought with them the rational argument, we've all been taught to believe that rationality somehow is a child of reason, that common sense is a child of reason, that memory is okay in limited amounts to the extent that it's a child of reason. But of course they're not. None of these things belong to rationality. They exist in and of themselves. And what makes us able to act without doing really stupid things is that we're able to use more than one quality at the same time. That's called a non-ideological position. An ideological position is to believe that there is only one quality, and that is the dominant quality, and all other human qualities are subsidiary to it. So we've been through eras where, for example, memory was dominant, which meant that that's an absolute monarch, in a sense. You know, I'm here because my father was here, because his father was here, sort of thing. And it works for a little while, but then it becomes stupidity. And we've had eras where ethics was dominant. Whenever you have a society dominated by religion, it's you know, obsessed by ethics. But of course, in the absence of any countervailing forces, ethics, before you batted an eyelash, is blowing people up and cutting them up in little pieces because they can't define the Holy Trinity properly, you know? Which gets you in the habit of making conscious choices which are ethical, so that when you're faced by the big choice, you know, which does come in most people's lives, one or more times, you're already in practice. It doesn't come as a great surprise to you that there is a choice between ethical and non-ethical behavior, and you can get at it because you have access or help thanks to common sense and rationality and intuition and imagination and memory. So but if you just wait for the great moment when you'll be called forward to be an ethical hero, it's not going to work out, because you're just not going to be prepared. The muscle will be, you know, flaccid or whatever. Let me start with some very simple things which may seem to be off topic. As you know, your neighbor India has a severe problem with farmer suicide. There's been an argument for some time that the cause of the suicide is the drive to convince people with small plots of land to buy expensive seeds which don't produce seeds which you can replant. There is a counter argument to that. There's a sort of big pushback on that, saying, well, actually, it has to do with the small plots of land. Yeah, we know that. Or it has to do with the fertilizer, but actually the fertilizer is related to the seeds. I mean, it's a certain kind of fertilizer with a certain kind of seeds, all of which cost money. And so on. It has to do with debt. We know that. The debt comes in large part from the fact that the system is too expensive for the size of the plots of land, and you only have to have 1 year of lack of rain or what disease for farmers to fall into debt, and they can never recover from it. It's too geared up to function. Now, I was told today, and I don't know if this is true, so it would be interesting for you to tell me if it's true, that you don't have a wave of suicide among farmers in Bangladesh. That's really interesting because, you know, the conditions are different, I understand, but they're not that different. There are poverty problems, there's lack of ownership of land, there's small plots of land, and so on. And when you stand back from the technocratic argument, what you realize is that the big difference is that, as I understand it, you haven't really allowed Monsanto and company to play a role here with expensive seeds, and that in a sense perhaps is the reason that farmers are not, even though they're even perhaps in worse conditions than Indian ways, that they haven't fallen into this sense of despair which leads to the suicide. Is this true? I mean, I haven't done the research, I'm not sure. But I thought it was really interesting when you have two countries side by side and you have such radically different outcomes. After all, suicide and not suicide is a very radical outcome. And so you have to ask yourself, well, if this argument I've just made isn't true, what is true? And I don't mean by that a sort of parsing of details. What is the fundamental argument that drives farmers to suicide and farmers not to suicide? I'll give you a parallel argument. I'm Canadian, like all Canadians pretty well, who we arrived in the country as peasants, illiterate peasants, including my family, and so I'm a farmer at heart, a peasant farmer at heart, and I satisfied this a few years ago because we have a house in the south of France, my wife and I, and we own 2 fields of olive trees, and we produce some of the finest olive oil in the world at a very high price. We still lose money, but like a lot of farmers. But it was very interesting, a few years ago when we started, we decided we would do it organic, sort of almost wild, because our fields are surrounded by uncultivated land. And so I went off to the local cooperative, farmers cooperative, and said, well, tell me about your fertilizers, and what about your organic fertilizers? And the man said to me, he said, oh, you mean you're not going to use traditional fertilizer? In other words, we'd reached a stage in terms of the technocracy, modernism, and technology that chemical fertilizer was traditional. And I said, but what do you mean it's traditional? It's only about 50, 60 years old. He said, oh, I never thought about that. But what was interesting about it was the fact that in the mind of the Western farmer, that the tradition was industrial farming, even though actually it's quite recent. But what it also meant was that industrial farming had slipped into a stage which could be called a stage of mental degeneracy, which comes from believing that you're doing this because it's the right thing to do because you've always done it, you know, even though it's only 50 years. And the third example, these are just very minor examples, is that I come from a country which produces a lot of apples. And apples are best in northern climates because, you know, the Bhutanese apples, for example, in this area. Why? Because the winter is good for them, the sharp climate, the warmth that doesn't last too long. Whereas, for example, apples from Provence in the south of France are disgusting. They're soft, they're mushy, because it's too hot, right? And so I sit in Canada, and 12 months of the year in all major shops, most apples for sale come from New Zealand, which is a certain distance away. And they're cheaper than the Canadian apples, even though the Canadian apples are actually quite cheap. So when you actually see that, what you realize is that industrial agriculture, which is based on rational theory, utilitarian interpretations of rational theory, has produced a totally irrational outcome. And the irrational outcome is that you can produce an apple at one end of the world, and somehow by not including the full costs of producing that apple and of transporting it through an incapacity to use inclusive economics thinking, you can actually sell that apple cheaper on the other side of the world than apples that are produced on the spot. Now, I know that one of the things that involves is using probably upwards of 40 different chemicals while it's on the tree, and then adding more chemicals, about 32 chemicals on the tree, and adding more chemicals in order to transport it and hold it for months on end. That is a logical, utilitarian outcome of rational theory, and it makes no sense at all. It's just lunacy. It's irrational. So I'm just, these sort of funny little examples I'm giving you, tell you about a loss of the sense of reality, of what happens, of what is an action, what is the outcome of an action, where does the outcome of the action lead? And it tells you also that our universities, many of them, our bureaucracies, our governments, our business community, are increasingly unable to think, which is to say, to think in an inclusive manner, which allows them to just say, well, wait a minute, why are we eating apples that have come from the other end of the world? Why are we doing that? And somebody will then give you some argument about globalization and the cheapest possible good and the marketplace. And they're all nonsense arguments, because in fact, what it's an outcome of is the lack of putting all the costs together. And probably, the taxpayers are probably paying for part of the cost of the apple in New Zealand through subsidies of agricultural land and so on. So you don't actually getting the real cost of the apple, which allows them to sell it for less than it's actually cost. So a sort of decline in inclusive thinking, and a rising admiration for the short-term results, and perhaps even more important, an admiration for short-term self-interest over an idea of the public interest and the public good. And if you stand back and look at it, most of what's now called rationality is really linear utilitarianism of a very low level. It's not rationality as it would have been understood by Voltaire. That's why my book's called Voltaire's Bastards, because it's basically, had Voltaire come along today, he would have looked at all the people who invoke people like him as, we are the children of rationality, and he would say, no, these are not my children, these are maybe my bastards. It was a very daring title for a 1,000-page book, which my career was going to rise or fall on. I think one of the most important things to notice in the midst of all of this is, you'll excuse my being very precise about some things, you'll notice over the last 30 years, 40 years, the rise of one term which is particularly important. It's, terms that rise to importance and terms that fall. And one of the terms that's really come into the forefront over the last 4 decades is efficiency, deliverables and so on, but efficiency. Of course, efficiency isn't a philosophical idea. It's really a shop floor idea. Can we produce brooms efficiently? That's what it is. It's a very minor concept. So it's very important to notice that along with the rise of globalism, you found that one of the central arguments of globalism was efficiency, which tells you a great deal about the lack of intellectual thought inside the concept of globalization. That it really wasn't people having thought through a different way for the world to run. It was really a very binary, intellectually speaking, approach towards what works and doesn't work and how can you make society work. And all of this, all of what I'm talking about, has a very interesting trail to it historically. And the trail really begins with authoritarianism coming right on top of the first breakthroughs in the West, the first breakthroughs of rationality and the Enlightenment and so on, which is that before the 18th century was over, a guy called Napoleon appears and puts forward an alternate argument to how rationality will be used. It will not be used for the purposes of citizenship, democracy, egalitarianism, inclusion. Rather, he says, that's all very inefficient. It's very, and there's the term, it rises to the top under people like Napoleon for the first time. That's very inefficient, it's very uncertain, and it's very Hobbesian. I mean, people are dangerous. We have to have a system that stops people from killing each other. So, here I am, Napoleon, and I'm a wonderful person. I'm a hero. And I love you. And you love me. And we're going to have a very personal relationship bordering on sexual. I mean, the romantic idea of the hero and the people. It's pseudo-sexual romanticism. And on top of this personal relationship, which will take the place of citizenship and hard work of individuals engaging in society, I will engage all of the experts coming out of the universities who are specialists in every possible area, and I will make them work and deliver efficiently for you under my heroic leadership. And that became the alternate model to something that even Babur wouldn't have admired that model, because he admired, if you like, the imagination and culture. It wasn't simply an emperor. But that became the model that leader after leader after leader would engage in when they didn't want democracy to work. And the 20th century was filled with examples of that, of which probably the most interesting was not Hitler but Mussolini. Because Mussolini, apart from being very silly, brought with him about half the philosophers of Italy who believed in a very clear explanation of why democracy doesn't work and why citizenship doesn't work and why thinking by citizens doesn't work, and that in the place of that you would put this thing which Napoleon had almost invented, but which Mussolini really finalized, called corporatism, which was that instead of individuals believing in empathy, the other, justice, working together, different religions working together, different communities working together, different colors working together, sharing in various ways, that instead of that, the primary characteristic of individuals would be that they belong to interest groups, specialist interest groups, and that the job of the leader was to oversee the negotiated relationships between the interest groups. And that's the essence of authoritarianism, modern authoritarianism. The violence, the racism, all that stuff, that's secondary to this alternate idea of how the societies are going to work. And my feeling very strongly is that all of us, not simply in the West, but in India and China and so on, in Bangladesh, have been living the outcomes of this corporatist, authoritarian idea, which of course is wedded closely to a worship of technology, because one of the central arguments as to why this theory is necessary is because progress is happening, and progress is linked to technology, and technology can't be stopped. Because the only way you could stop it, according to them, is by being backward. Whereas there could be another argument, a humanist argument, which would say, well, we can decide how we're going to use technology, right? After all, we invented it. Why didn't we become passive before it once we've invented it? And to which there really is no answer, except that the efficient running of society requires that we let technology run, and that we use the technocrats under the king to keep up with it as best we can, which makes us into very passive people. That the individual in a corporatist society is deeply passive. And that passivity is tied to the obsession with self-interest as opposed to the other. If you're interested in the other, it takes a lot of work. If you're just interested in yourself, it's not that much work. It's really not that much work. It's not that complicated. So, what we've seen with the rise of corporatism over the last 50 to 60 years in its latest form is a gradual shift in country after country from, for example, all of us being referred to as citizens. Instead of that, we're referred to as taxpayers, which is a very different thing from a citizen. The rise of self-interest, the rise, particularly through the universities, of the idea that we have to be, our knowledge has to be put into silos of specialization. And this is not a bad thing. Specialization is not a bad thing. All of us, when we have a heart attack, we want to have a doctor who can handle it. We don't want to have somebody who only knows about feet and legs doing heart operations, so we're in favor of specialization. But this idea that once you're a specialist, that is your primary, that is your corporation, that's where you belong, that's what your language is, that's what your dialect is, and that you can't walk out of the section of the hospital or the university that does hearts and have an open and frank conversation with skin doctors, let alone with agronomists. And that somehow this inability to have a conversation between the people who know then says, well, who can manage this conversation, And that is, of course, this rise of the small Napoleons, the small Mussolinis, which is to say the managers, right, who have no knowledge of anything, have very little culture, but are in the business of sort of playing with the pieces of specialization and self-interest. And from the university's point of view, and I know it's not the case of this one, what we've seen as a result is an astonishing rise, particularly over the last 40 years, of management schools, business schools, government management schools, to the point where in most countries they're now the dominant element in universities. Universities are changing, very august universities are changing their structure of what matters because the money comes for the management schools. And of course, the management schools are, from an intellectual point of view, vacant. They're form over content. There is no content. Because somewhere out there are managers who are going to manage it all. I'm simplifying grossly, but this is actually what has been happening over the last few years. And I don't want to use the word dumbing down, but management schools are very low-level operations from an intellectual point of view. And they've been aided and abetted their rise to power by the almost more recent rise to power of the departments of economics. Now, economics is a really interesting area, unlike management, but we've seen the economics schools themselves clean out, in large part, the intellectual questioning which was so central to their birth, with multiple ideas arguing within the departments of economics. And we've seen more and more departments of economics become places of single thought, which is basically the dominant thought of our day: neoconservatism, neoliberalism, deliverables, efficiency, and so on. And there's been enormous change in the departments of economics over the last 40 years, so that they've moved from the idea that economics is a matter of questioning, of doubt, of uncertainty, of argument, because it's not a science, to a new school which says it is a science and they have the truth and they've got the statistics to prove that they have the truth. And this has left us in a very, very difficult position. I mean, I know that in this part of the world there are schools of economics which do have questioning within them, but I can promise you that in most of the world there is a solid agreement inside the departments of economics, and in a sense it's supported by the schools of management. So that even when you have a catastrophe like the financial collapse of very few years ago, no change takes place in the departments of economics. There is no change in what is taught in the first and second year. One just goes on with the same theories that brought, in a sense, the collapse upon us. So, and a few moments ago, I mentioned this idea of the linkage between technology and progress and rationality, and somehow the idea that it's all linked, that progress in this form is all linked to an idea of good, of goodness, of improvement. And I think that there was a very important moment which should have made everybody sit up and think more seriously about what all these words meant, which was that, you know, in the years preceding the Second World War, IBM produced the Holroyd counting machine, which was the precursor to the modern ordinateur computer. And it was the thing that organized factories and so on, that you could check in and check out. And you could count in a new way. You could do numbers in a new way at an enormous speed that had never been possible before. And the head of IBM very quickly in the 1930s developed a close relationship with the Italian and German regimes. And one of the direct outcomes of this was, and nobody ever asked this question, there's one very large book written on the subject, very badly written, but very accurate. People don't, apart from that, don't talk about it, which is that the Holocaust was only possible because of the Horowitz counting machine. What I mean by that is, not that it wasn't that the Nazis didn't want to kill the Jews, but that it was impossible to actually round up people with that speed and organize it with that speed. It had never been, I mean, there have been little riots in the past of the sort of riots one knows also in this part of the world, but to actually organize the rounding up of an entire population which is spread out through the other population was never possible. What made it possible was the use of the Horowitz counting machine to feed in the information so that when the day came, you could actually round people up overnight. And IBM moved through Europe with the Nazis, helping them organize the rounding up of the Jews in country after country after country. And even in the death camps, in the big death camps, there was always an IBM Horowitz counting machine because it was very complicated to organize how to kill people, how to keep track of who you were killing and how you should kill them and in what order and at what speed. And in 1944-45, as the Allied armies moved across Europe and liberated the death camps, they liberated the Horowitz counting machines and gave them back to IBM. And IBM then did things, I don't know, like give them to governments to help organize healthcare. So the point really of this is very simple, which is there is no ethical content in technology, and there is no ethical content in progress based on technology. It can organize healthcare, it can organize the Holocaust. It doesn't care, it's just a machine. So when people say that somehow progress and technology are intimately linked and this will lead to a better world, they're actually missing the fundamental point that there is no ethics included in this concept of progress. And the point which is, I suppose, deeply relevant in this country is that that view of progress always has within it the idea that whatever is wrong today, we will motor through, and there will be difficult moments, but eventually it will produce enough wealth that the bad things will stop happening. You know, the garment factories will stop falling down because we produced enough wealth and things will be better. Whereas in fact, we know from the late 18th century on in the English Industrial Revolution that there was a clear choice between the capitalists who said, you know, it is a tragedy that we have children in these factories. It is a tragedy we have girls. It is a tragedy that their hands are being cut off in machines. But, you know, that's the cost of progress, and eventually it'll all work out. And besides, we can't afford the protections, because if we put the protections in place, we won't make the profits, so we'll have to shut down the factories. And along came a guy called Robert Owen, a model factory man, and put in place factories which were reasonably safe for the day, which didn't employ little girls, which didn't employ small children, which had education, it had dance classes. And the fascinating thing is, this is extremely relevant to today, and this relationship between technology, progress, capitalism. The fascinating thing was that Robert Owen made larger profits than the businessmen who were running the factories that did not pay properly, that exploited children, that were unsafe. And you would have thought that they would have embraced him and said, oh, thank you so much. You've demonstrated to us how we can do better. And instead of that, they hated him. He was the most hated person in the early stages of British capitalism because, in a sense, he demonstrated that you could have ethics and make money and use rationality and be a part of a humanist argument. So it's that argument of the late 18th century is precisely the argument which is avoided by corporatism and has been deeply avoided by the globalist argument of the last 40 years. It's always about, wait, you know, it will be prettier later on when we've all put more things in place. The reality is that it isn't about waiting in order to put fair conditions in place. It's actually the exact opposite. That if you begin by an idea of justice, you can actually make a great deal more money a lot faster, and you can hold on to it because you've used it in a much more sensible way. The other element which has been linked to all of this sort of linear utilitarian view of how society works over the last 40 years in particular, is the idea that the marketplace worships first and foremost the cheapness of goods. Mass production and the cheapness of goods. First of all, there's no serious economist in history who's ever said that. It certainly was never said by any of the, it's nowhere in the Wealth of Nations. Nothing anywhere in the Wealth of Nations says that the cheapness of goods is a central characteristic of capitalism. It simply isn't true. But if you believe that the cheapness of goods is a key factor, it isn't simply that it allows, say, Bangladesh to break through. The theory is that's the only way Bangladesh could break through, right? The cheapness of the goods. But what it actually allows you to do is to hang on to the idea that the success of a society is not tied to justice. It's tied to the cheapness of goods. And if you can just push on, eventually it'll all balance itself out. This, as I say, there's no serious economist in history who's ever said this. And capitalism is not about a race to produce the cheapest goods. No, it's not even about a race to produce the most goods, which is the other misunderstanding of the last 40 years. You know, in the origins of capitalism, there are several aspects about competition and so on. And one of them is a race to higher productivity. But that's only because there was a lack of goods. There's a shortage of goods. But the curious reality of the last, since about 1960, is that we've been in a surplus of virtually every kind of good that exists. That doesn't mean it's been distributed properly, you know. But we actually, you know, we can produce most manufactured goods in about 2 Chinese cities, you know. So there's no possibility of any kind of sensible capitalist competition when you're in such heavy overproduction. And in fact, if we were thinking in an integrated way, we would say, well, look, we redefined, we came out of mercantilism in the late 18th century. We changed capitalism in the middle of the 19th century, changed it again at the end of the 19th century. We haven't made a serious change in over 100 years. But clearly this is the moment when you would say, we no longer need to be pushing mass production to the edge because we have too many goods, and that's what's producing the prices down. That's what's causing the prices to drop, that we're in surplus, including, frankly, in agriculture. In spite of the fact, in part because we haven't focused on the thing we're failing at, which is distribution of goods, fair distribution of goods as opposed to mass production of goods. So all of what I'm saying leads me to 2 things. One is that when you look at the last 10 years and you see this astonishing rise in governments claiming to be democratic governments, breaking their own laws all over the world, both the democracies, the not democracies, and everybody in between, breaking their own laws to spy on their citizens, surveillance, to build up walls of secrecy around what they're doing. You're seeing, first of all, you're seeing an outcome of, you know, at the lowest level, an outcome of a tragedy in the United States, which is a very real tragedy and a horrible thing. But what you're seeing is governments, not just the American government, government after government after government, leaping upon an atmosphere of fear in order to take advantage of it to break laws of privacy and to be more and more secret about what they're doing. But this sort of response is exactly the same kind of approach that we saw over the preceding 30 years, over the preceding 60 years, which is to say the rise of corporatism, the rise of the idea that the state is not about the individual, the state is about interest groups, that the state must fear the citizen, and therefore one of the ways to stop the citizen from being dangerous is to keep secrets from them and to watch what they're doing. And all that was required was a crisis which would allow governments to start rolling back protections of the citizenry, which it took 150 years to put in place and came in part or in whole later in say in Asia because of the empire, but you know, those things started to be put in place after the empires left. But suddenly that people could roll it back for exactly the reasons that I described, the problems inside the universities, the dominance of management which has no ethics within it, the absence of an intellectual concept of what progress might look like, what running a society might look like. And indeed, this astonishing explosion in surveillance and secrecy has been met with some, but very little protest. Governments haven't fallen over it. It's astonishing that governments haven't fallen over an issue which is so important. And it does have a comic side to it. When I published Voltaire's Bastards in 1993, there's a chapter on secrecy in it. And I pointed out that we were in a maddened rush towards state secrecy and corporate secrecy, and that this came out of the rise of the corporatist view of life. And the most honest people in the world on this issue are the Americans. Their statistics are actually the best. They actually have separate bodies who count things that are not influenced by the people who are in government. It's quite interesting how good they are at it. And one of the things they do is count secrets. They have somebody, I don't know what it's called, they have a body whose job it is, how many secrets have been created in the United States this year, and how many people have access to the secrets at what level. Nobody else, I mean, Canadians, we'd lie totally. I mean, the French lie, the Germans lie. Maybe you don't. Maybe you're different, but everyone else is lying about it. The Americans are telling the truth. It's really interesting. And in 1993, the Americans were creating approximately 7 million new secrets every year. So you see, it's very funny, right? It's deeply comic. Since this group, if we got together and raised a bit of money, we could go out and figure out how to build a nuclear bomb among us, right? So what are the 7 million secrets? Well, what they are is, of course, it's a phenomenon of technocracy, of management, of the Napoleonic Mussolinian system, that the power that you get, that make you feel, the power you have inside your job is that you know things other people can't know. And you stop them from knowing it. And you use the classified system, the secret system, the top secret system, to give yourself importance, which of course shuts down the government because you can't spread the information around. And corporations are the same. I mean, corporations are even more ridiculous. There's a fortune being made in shredding companies. They move around through the business sectors every day, and people bring down their papers to be shredded. I mean, what's in the papers? And what they had for lunch? You know, how many bottles of water they sold to somebody? I mean, it's nonsense. It's a sort of the ego of the unimportant person feeling unimportant because they're inside a management structure. Anyway, last year, the United States created 55 million new secrets. So between 1990 and 2010, they went from 7 million secrets a year to 55 million secrets a year. So you can call that silly, which it is, meaningless. No, it's not, because it's actually an impediment to democracy. But certainly it's the description of authoritarianism, of power out of control, not really being willing to enter into open discussion on important things. And it's a sign, and this again is, if you like, maybe the last element in the rise of the Napoleonic Mussolinian system, which is fear, which is, if you're not going to have a system of citizens who are talking to each other, and you're going to be a Hobbesian and believe that citizens are dangerous, then one of the most important elements used by government is to make people afraid of everything. So People were afraid of, drugs, so we had a war on drugs. Now we have a war on terror. And nobody's really doing any serious numbers on how many people are killed or how many people are blown up. It's every person who's killed, it's terrible, but it's nothing compared to road accidents or whatever. But it's used relentlessly, not simply in the United States, but all over the world. I mean, I just saw a big thing about the new government of India is going to do a new study on the fear of terrorism. So that it's become a leitmotif which allows governments not to act in a manner which is normal for democracy. And it is fascinating because, of course, remember I said, and I was being serious, that Napoleon basically said, I love you, you love me. And it was this pseudo-sexual relationship between the hero and the people. But of course, love and fear are intimately linked. And so it's not at all surprising that this model brings with it not simply the idea of an emotional relationship between the heroic leader and the people, but the fear, which is also a central part of that relationship. So let me just finish by saying that I think that it's going to be extremely difficult to turn this around. I think that the system is so strong, it's very hard to see how one turns it around and moves away from the authoritarian model and actually gives real meaning to democracy. We know that, for example, one of the outcomes of what I've just been describing has been a relentless rise in corruption. Not just here or in India, in the United States, in Europe, everywhere, a rise in corruption, not just in Russia. And that rise in corruption, you can analyze it precisely, your own example or the example of India or the example of the United States or the example of France, but that's what academics and students should do. But you can also stand back and say it's perfectly natural that there would be a rise in corruption because we're running a system which doesn't contain ethics, which has been built upon an idea of self-interest, not ethics. And once you have a system, a governmental system, that pretends that it's inclusive but actually is run without ethics, why would you be surprised that there'd be a rise in corruption? And that's what any philosopher would tell you. It's not a utilitarian problem that is happening, it's a problem of the enormous vacuum which remains in society around self-interest. Total vacuum, and it gets filled by things like corruption and fear. So I'm going to end with something which may seem a little weak to you, but I don't think it is. I'm not at all convinced that one of the big outcomes of the last 40 years holds in it the solution to our problems, which is the rise of the NGOs. As you probably know, we went from a handful of NGOs to millions of NGOs in 40 years. And some of them do very good work. A lot of them do. But the problem with it was, and is this, that what it meant and has meant is that young people listened to the leaders who started saying to them about 40 years ago, in the 70s, started saying, look, please elect us, but we can't do much. And we can't do much because of the inevitability of progress, the need to deliver, the need for efficiency, and unfortunately democracy is not very efficient. But we're going to do our best, but we can't really do very much. And in a way it was, it discouraged young people from wanting to go into politics. They had contempt for these men and women who were unable to deliver ideas about where society could go. And so they started setting up these parallel organizations, the NGOs, which were lobby groups working for the good. The difficulty is that they gave up the possibility of power for the possibility of influence. They left a vacuum in power, which was filled precisely by their enemies, in large part. So it was a very unwise move from a strategic point of view, because you leave the place where you could actually pass a law that would make a difference. You let your enemy go in and pass laws, and then you march in the street or do whatever in order to convince them to change their mind. Does it actually work as a strategy? If you see what I mean. I'm not saying NGOs shouldn't exist, but if you ask yourself, for example, why so little progress has been made on questions like I'll call it the Monsanto issue in industrial farming, or why so little progress has been made on issues like global warming, it's in large part because power was abandoned to people who were not going to do anything, and in fact, to some extent, belonged to the problem, or viable by the problem. And the people who could have changed things were on the outside marching, when they could have been on the inside passing the laws. In fact, most of the environmental difficulties could have been solved long ago if the people in the environmental movement had taken over the political parties and passed the laws. You know, it's not that complicated. There were some decisions that needed to be made. They still need to be made. It's getting more and more desperate. But the people are not in office. People have not gone and ruined their lives and dirtied their lives, in a sense, by going into politics and changing society. There's a kind of commitment that's required of honest people in politics, which is much more stressful than what's required of dishonest people. You know, for one thing, it ruins your marriage, makes your children hate you, and it's very bad for your health, all the rest of it. It's not a good life, politics. But there's a sort of being there and staying there and passing the laws and being there at every level, from school boards, municipalities, all the way up to the top, in order to ensure that certain kinds of things are done. And that rise of the NGOs and decline of politics was a very profound sign of the success story of corporatism and the loss of the idea of the citizen. The loss of the idea that the source of legitimacy in any country is not the government, it's the citizen. That nothing, it doesn't matter what your theory is. I mean, it could be here, it could be in the United States, it could be in China. What does the idea of the good emperor and in China mean? It means that the emperor can only remain so long as the citizen agrees. That's always existed in China for thousands of years. It's not a democratic idea, but it is the same idea as the democratic idea, that legitimacy comes out of the people. It doesn't come from the top, it comes from the bottom. I've forgotten the Chinese phrase about the mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven is you have it as long as you satisfy the needs of the people. You lose the confidence of the people, and heaven removes you from power. That's what it means. So what we've been witnessing, and part of over the last few decades, is an acceptance of the idea that we are not the source of legitimacy in our own societies. That's an enormous victory for corporatism and an enormous defeat for any idea of democracy or inclusion or humanism, or whatever you want to call it. And so when you see, for example, a Broadcast Act, I believe it's here, passed recently here, which has within it clauses which are very short and hard to find, if you're not an expert, which say things like it's an imprisonable offense to criticize the nation. So how does the government of any country get to tell the citizens what they can say about their own country? I mean, let me say this as a Canadian. Canada's my country. If I want to say that Canada is doing a lousy job, I'll say it. It's my country. It doesn't belong to the government. It belongs to me. I hired those people. I elected them in, I'll elect them out. They don't get to tell me what patriotism is, or what loyalty is, or what the limits of my possibility of engagement are. And the very last thing I would say, which from that very basic idea, is that I think that things will be turned around by a slight shift from the idea of the NGO to the idea of a certain kind of engagement by citizens. In other words, there's charity, which is not the solution to anything. I mean, we have the right to do charity, but it's not the solution to anything. But there's the involvement and commitment of the citizen in their society. Volunteerism, engagement, and so on. And I think that it's that kind of engagement by citizens which doesn't belong to separate bodies which have a legal status like NGOs. It actually belongs to any citizen. I think that's the essence of how societies will be changed, because that's what creates the critical mass, which then changes the way politics will function. Politics, at its best, always functioned. It was the same thing, frankly, under the good king, has always functioned because people on the ground engaged themselves to ensure that things were better. And I spent half of the day today with people who are working with farmers on holding seeds for 2 to 3 years. That's engagement, which will allow the farming community to set an example which eventually, hopefully, will become big enough that one can turn to a certain kind of government and say, this works, that doesn't work, we could go down this road. But I also spent part of the day down near the river with a group of young Bangladeshis who are working with street kids. And it's not charity, it's not really NGO work, it's the engagement of young, middle class, upper middle class, not looking to be thanked at gala dinners or not looking to have their names in the paper, just down there working with the street kids in a very interesting grassroots way. And this organization is run by a guy called Farhad Hossain. And very interesting, not original, but something which requires time and effort and for which you will not be thanked. And that effort that I saw today, that is precisely the sort of thing which will undo the damage which is being done by corporatism in its various forms all around the world today. And so I think it's marvelous to see it in this city, and I'm sure there are lots more examples like it. But I think all of us who have had or have something to do with universities, professors, but also students, have to be asking ourselves, are we engaged in that way? Are we going out once or twice a week and taking part in places where we could, unpaid and unthanked, have a role to play in changing the way society works at the grassroots? If we do that, I think we'll begin to find the mechanisms to change political parties, to change government, to change arguments in elections, and we'll then begin to believe that technology is not something which leads the way, it's something which we use as we wish to use it, or don't wish to use it, that we shape it. It doesn't shape us to a far greater extent than we would believe. Thank you very much.
So we're going to open up to some Q&A. I have a couple of requests of the audience. Please stand up, introduce yourselves. Please limit your question to a question. And please don't make a statement. And who would like to ask the first question? There's a microphone going around.
Thank you for your wonderful lecture. We thoroughly enjoyed it. My brief question is that, are you hopeful about social media, which is a manifestation of information technology in making the citizen engaged and bringing back the long-lost idea of the citizen? Thank you.
Social media. Some things have already disappeared, have already been bypassed and so on. In terms of what's happening right now, I think Twitter is a fantastic tool because it moves very, very fast and allows you to draw people's attention to all sorts of things. And I think a lot of people are using Twitter as an editor, almost as a newspaper, so that they follow you, or they follow you, or they follow me because they think I'm going to indicate to them, or you're going to indicate to them, things on a daily basis that they should be looking at. That's what a newspaper or television used to do, or a newspaper can still do. Facebook, I'm a lot less convinced by. I think it can be very self-indulgent in a way that Twitter has more difficulty being self-indulgent, and almost dangerous in a way, and can be used by people who are quite easily, who are destructive. But I have friends who use it. But I think the point is that we're going to see more and more things being invented, and then you'll suddenly say, oh, I'm going to abandon this and use this. The fact is this, which if we're extremely vigilant, can be very helpful and already is to some extent. But at the same time, governments have understood and corporations have understood that these could be mechanisms for control and for commerce. So I can tell you as president of PEN that, emails, it's a nightmare. I can't say anything. Anything of importance, I can't say. It's, you may or may not like Salman Rushdie. He's a friend of mine. He is a courageous guy. And when he was in trouble, we did some things, and we had to be very careful what we said on the phone, and there were certain words you didn't use and so on. We're right back to that. In an email, when I'm dealing on China, for example, I can't use the word China, I can't use the word of a prisoner, I can't use the word of a town, anything like that will just draw them to it. So we're right back to this sort of, childish code system. And even then, say someone like me, they're probably reading it all anyway. They probably, they've got thousands of people working on controlling the internet in China. And so since I'm president of PEN, they've probably got a couple of people who just do me 24 hours a day to pay attention. We work on the assumption. In fact, the other day, I was on Skype with a very senior ambassador of a country, talking about a problem in a country where this person was ambassador. And as we came on the line, this senior ambassador said, "Hi, John, and I just want to welcome all of you to our conversation." I said, yeah, this is Skype. You always think Skype's okay, but no, it isn't. And obviously that government, which is what major government, believes that Skype is just as penetrable as all the rest. So, yes, no. One has to be very clever about how to use this stuff.
There's a question right in the front here.
Thank you, sir. I'm a retired diplomat, heading a think tank. I have two very brief questions. You mentioned about the Indian farmers and the Bangladeshi farmers, and why the Indian farmers are committing suicides and the Bangladeshis are not. I think tend to miss the fact that the role of the government in Bangladesh is quite different. The government supplies the seeds and whatever is necessary to the farmers, though the holdings are about the same as in India. So that or less, could be less, possibly less, you're right. But then the thing that prevents them from even thinking about committing suicide is the fact that they are going to get the fertilizers and whatever. That's number one. Number two is that the Holocaust you mentioned about, which we absolutely condemn and we have condemned. As a matter of fact, the Nuremberg trial that took place following the Holocaust, which has been a great supportive factor for Bangladesh, with which I am deeply involved. The trial that is being held in Bangladesh on those who committed crimes against humanity in 1971. You see, the Germans, as you said, they had IBM support. And they killed 6+ million Jews, which is terrible. But then, in Bangladesh, the Pakistanis killed about 3 million Bengalis. They didn't have any IBMs, not to my knowledge. So, how do you bring these two facts together? And of course, I must add here, before I sit down, that the Nuremberg trial that took place and the principles and the judgments that they had left behind are helping us, and me in particular, because I have written the book for the trial and for the tribunal. In writing the book, I took the help of practically the entire part of the Nuremberg trial, from Justice Jackson's ruling till how many people were hanged and were not hanged and why they were not hanged. So that is a fantastic thing that has come out. But then of course, say Rwanda genocide.
Is there a question in the...
Didn't have any ideas.
Well, the answer is, in the case of Europe, the difficulty for the Nazis was that the Jewish population was extremely integrated into the rest of the population and not visible in any particular way. And so you couldn't go into an area, there weren't really ghettos. You couldn't, you know, if they're ghettos, it's easy. You just go in and you kill everybody in the ghetto. And equally, in Rwanda, there wasn't the kind of integration, so it was relatively easy to identify who you wanted to kill. And I mean, interestingly enough, although that seems like the wrong words, in Rwanda, they used the most effective method for killing, if you're not going to use gas chambers, which was they used knives and hatchets as opposed to guns, because you actually kill each person, and they were quite easy to find, as I understand Rwanda. I don't know, I've read about what happened here. I can't really answer the question about what happened here, except from what I have read, they seem to know who they were after. Whereas in Europe, they didn't know who they were after. You know, the German Jews were heroes of the First World War. I mean, you couldn't just go into, there weren't apartment buildings filled with Jews. There was, you know, and the families were mixed. It was a very complicated parsing of the population that took place. You know, it's as if you said, we're going to get all the left-handed people. You have to go around and get everybody to put their left hand up or something. You know, it was very difficult. So I think that the example holds, and I actually think that if, you know, I know the government gives the seeds, but there's also, as I say, these other moves to ensure that there are seeds being held locally, and also the decision not to use seeds which produce plants that don't produce seeds. So those factors still remain in the example. I said I don't think my example at the beginning is perfect, but I think it still holds. Yeah.
Question here.
My question is, you talked about different institutions like universities, also talked about the group, and they have their own interest, you know, and it is their interests, and it is really difficult nowadays to find any institutions or group without any interest. But in the name of self-interest, or in the name of what you can say strategic essentialism, some group, for example feminists, they are even embracing the inhumanization or dehumanization in lieu of their freedom. How can you look at it at first? My second question is that in terms of the use of technology, the question is who is controlling the technology? For example, if you talk about the information technology, it's one of the outcome or upshoot, you can say Yahoo, Google, or many more like this you can say. The question is who is controlling the information? And as a citizen of third world country, how can we intervene into this sort of control? My last question is all about the care of this health.
No, let's keep it to, that's enough, thanks.
You know, I mean, I'm not sure I understand your first question, but I would just say this, that I happen to be lucky enough to be married to somebody who's quite a famous feminist. And so my positions are pretty clear on this subject. And frankly, the thing that is most amazing to me is that considering that the feminist movement began seriously, what, in the 1890s, let's say, about, what is astonishing is how well people like you and me have done at stopping it from moving forward very fast. Men have held on to power in an unjustifiable way to a remarkable extent. Now, part of it's because we structured a lot of the institutions to serve us, and we've been very, very careful not to let them be restructured. So that, I'll give you an example. Chief Justice of Canada, who's a woman, fabulous Chief Justice, Beverly McLaughlin, was talking a little while ago to the head of one of the largest law firms in Canada, and this guy, this old guy, was saying, well, you know, Chief Justice, I mean, we just don't get it. I mean, we open up these spaces, because the girls come out top of the class usually. We open up these spaces, they come in and they leave after about 2 years, and we're doing everything we can. And I mean, the Chief Justice looked at him and said, you know, I don't think you are. You haven't changed the structure of your law firm to reflect the kind of lives that they have to lead. You're still running it as if it was for men. And so they leave. And they they become lawyers of the government, they do other kinds of things, but they know that the big law firms are designed to chase women out. Government itself, the whole democratic system itself was set up as an old boys club. It was all based on the fact that in some way the women were at home and the boys got away from it and went and drank in Parliament, used it as a club, and we still run Parliament that way. You know, so the result is that there are a surprisingly small number of women in Parliament because they really hate it. I don't know a single woman in politics, and I know quite a few, or who went into politics, who likes it. Whereas all the men I know are in politics love it. It's like their little dream, you know? So I really just, 40 years has been the return of monopolies and oligopolies in the private sector. We were told we were going to have this amazing rise of competitive capitalism. What we actually got was a return of oligopolies and monopolies. And in all sorts of areas. And that's what the takeover community, the unfriendly takeovers of corporations, smaller corporations, is all about the return to oligopolies and monopolies. It's certainly not about risk, because it's usually about indebting the company you buy in order to buy it. But in the area of the new communications, the amazing thing is that so far we're allowing what are essentially monopoly situations to be created. I think the Europeans are on the edge of ordering the breakup of some of them. It won't happen out of the States, it's clear. And if the Europeans make a decision, that's going to be a really, really interesting change. I don't know exactly what form it'll take, but after all, the European market is a gigantic market. And then if other people outside of North America follow suit, like the Latin Americans, I don't know here, I think you'll see a pressure to break those places up. But you know, what it actually all comes back to is that we've had 40 years of one theory dominant. And that theory is now running out of steam. It's not doing very well. It's unable to solve problems. And my guess is that the next 10 years will, either in a disastrous or an interesting way, lead us into a new narrative about how societies are run. And so that's, in a way, if I persist in the kind of arguments I'm making, it's because I actually think we're at a moment when things will turn. And to give you a simple example, when I brought out Voltaire's Bastards, which was the first really big attack on business schools, not just a little one, but actually a major integrated attack on business schools is one part of it, you know, they wouldn't even speak to me. I mean, when I came into a room, the deans of the business schools would turn away, sort of thing, you know? And then about 7 years ago, where they had a meeting of, you know, all the deans of the important schools around the world, and they invited me to come and open it. I said, have you got the right number? I mean, sort of thing. And then they just asked, and I went and I spoke, and they were very upset. They thought they wanted to hear it, but they didn't. And then they just had another one of those meetings, and actually, they almost agreed. They have a major problem. They have a major problem, and they don't know what to do about it. Because they're not really trained to do anything about it. You know, so they know they're failing. They know they're not delivering. They know the kids are unhappy, and they know that they've gone on for 40 years saying to people, "You're going to become very special. You're going to get an MBA," whereas in fact all they're offering is a jumped-up commerce degree. And really, most of the kids just want a commerce degree because they just want to go out and do some business. But they're afraid to just get a commerce degree because it's not respected. So we're destroying our universities in order to produce a fallacy. Anyway, yes?
There's a question over in the corner, right there. And may I please request that you limit to one question?
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation.
Not quite so loud, just a little further away.
Okay. I've got two questions and they're
Please
linked
limit
together.
to one question. Thank you.
No, they're linked together.
Please
and that will be brief.
Please limit to one question.
You have said that we can change the society and make a better one when people engage themselves spontaneously in social activities. So how can they be motivated to do that? And my second question, corporations and capitalism has conditioned us to believe that we have to do where we have financial interest, and that has become our solid reality. How can we get out of this? Thank you very much.
Well, you know, the answer to both is narrative. Let me, you know, I'm going to say something to you that I've now been saying for 5 years as president of PEN. It's quite difficult to make jokes when you're the head of a human rights organization because it's a very serious world. But in fact, most of the people I know come out of prison are very funny about it, because that's the only way that you can kind of get through life. You know, if you look around the world today, there are, you know, 5 or 6 former presidents and prime ministers in jail. You know, I don't know, 7 or 8 CEOs in jail, a couple of generals, 900 writers, and about 100 of us are being killed on top of that. So what does that tell you? That tells you that narrative is more powerful than tanks, actually. The thing that frightens people with power, whether they're in corporations or government the most, is words, narrative. And so, you know, what you're talking about is that for the last 40 years, we have allowed a discourse to install itself, a narrative to install itself, which demeans us by telling us that we're driven by only self-interest unless we want to go away and have a family, which is only possible because we've looked after our self-interest. That's the narrative of the last 40 years. It's garbage. It's absolute garbage. It is not true. We have the right to make money, we have the right to self-interest, but that is not the driving force of society. It's an important element, it's not the main element. And again, there's virtually nothing in philosophy that agrees with this analysis, including, you know, the god of the globalist movement who wrote The Wealth of Nations. In fact, in the Wealth of Nations is filled with warnings not to allow self-interest to be too dominant. And his major book was the book he wrote before that, which is The Theory of Human Sentiments, Moral Sentiments, which is all about empathy. So one of the tricks of the departments of economics is that they don't actually read The Wealth of Nations. They read extracts from it, in order to avoid having to read the stuff where he says, don't allow too many businessmen to get together in a room, because if you do, they'll fix the prices. I mean, that's what it says. You know, it only talks about the invisible hand in a half a sentence once. And it's a reference to a local market, not an international market. So there's an enormous need to change the discourse, change the narrative. And I don't think that's that hard. And one of the ways you do that is through action. It's by engaging yourselves. It's by saying, actually, when somebody says to you, you know, the state tells us that we're not allowed to criticize the nation, you say, what do you mean? It's my nation. It's not their nation. They work for me. I don't work for them. If you start saying that, people say, oh yeah, I forgot that. My grandfather used to say that, or something. I don't know what they'll say. Yeah, my grandfather is probably what they'll say in this area, because it was all part of, you know, the beating of colonialism. And so it's all there. That other narrative is there. It needs a new form. And one of your jobs are you a student? One of your jobs as a student is to push for the narrative. And it's surprising how much of it is about language. And I think that also by engaging oneself at the grassroots level where needed, in a very serious and long-term way, you'll be surprised how that is a very easy way, not easy, that is a very sure way of altering the narrative, because you're not acting as if you're only driven by your self-interest. You're demonstrating your ethics, your muscle, your ethical muscle through your actions, and you're sticking to it. And, you know, part of that is you do that, and you come back into your classrooms where everybody's talking about the need to make money, and then they say, what did you do last night? And you talk about what you did. And they said, and the next thing you know, after a number of you have done it, people suddenly realize that it's far better to talk your way than their way. Why is it better? Because they feel better about themselves. They actually feel like human beings when they talk your way. So, I mean, I don't think it's that hard, but you have to, but the pessimism which has been installed through the discourse of self-interest it's so destructive to self-respect. And so, and students, not just professors, students need self-respect. And I think that's some of the ways of getting it.
Actually, I'm going to pass over to our MC here, one of our students, and have her ask a question. And
So I'm studying ethics and leadership right now, and Ethics and leadership.
Ethics and leadership.
Okay, so I have a question for you. Keeping in mind the short-term advantages and the long-term disadvantages of the utilitarian approach, do you think it's the right approach for the development of Bangladesh, not the urban or the technological or the economical development, but the social, the humane development of the country, of the people? That's it. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, that was the purpose of the story that I was telling you about Robert Owen, is that we already have established in history, and we've shown it again and again and again and again, that the successful way to run a society is imagine the other. Some level of ethics, a level of responsibility. We know that the utilitarian approach doesn't work. We know that utilitarianism is a tertiary characteristic. And I think the other thing which is really important is this, that one of the central characteristics of utilitarianism as a sort of subcategory of rationality is that it's linear. And of course, that's just not the way it works. That isn't actually the way civilization functions. You don't leave anything behind. And when you think you've left it behind, it comes out of nowhere and thumps you on the head. So that, when you look today and you say, well, why is there a return of racism? Why is populism so powerful? Why is both the positive but the negative side of religion, in every religion, making a comeback? Because we've been going down this narrow little track, which is, I described earlier, as not containing ethics at the core of it, and not containing imagination, frankly, either. And so there's this enormous vacuum around it. And the vacuum, I'm mixing metaphors here desperately, but it gets filled up. And so it's getting, people, suddenly out of nowhere comes populism, racism, but also out of nowhere come these young people down, in the middle of this city, working with street kids. Nobody asked them to do that. They just obviously thought this would be a really good thing to be doing. So that the really important thing is to be aggressive and optimistic about the possibilities of the public good and what you can apply to it. There's a very good little book written by an American philosopher called Richard Rorty, who died 5 years ago. Does anybody remember? Who was a wonderful guy, and he wrote in his last sort of years this very short book, which was deep frustration, not simply with the neoconservatives, but with the liberals. Because he felt that what the neoconservatives were doing was evil, and what the liberals were doing was lazy. That they were sort of at Harvard, waiting to be called to Washington to do 5 years of good work before going back to comfort at Harvard sort of thing. And he said, the way that the reforms were made in the United States from sort of 1905 to 1980, 75, was that people engaged over their whole lifetime. They went out and they fought in these little tiny elections, and they worked in these little tiny organizations, and they gradually changed the nature and the shape of society. And they stayed and did it. It was a lifetime commitment. And as long as they were holding on and doing that, real progress was made, which was not linear, it was spherical or circular. Yeah.
I'd like to take one last question if we can. I believe there was a hand, everyone's pointing in that corner, so Professor Ibrahim.
What I've understood is your solution in the whole problem is empowering the citizen to take control ultimately. And what will you say about C.P. Snow's Two Culture lecture he gave in 1959 about this humanities and science and technology not talking to each other? Do you think listening to him is an answer?
It's so long since I've read C.P. Snow, to be honest. I can hardly remember the argument, but what I'm talking about is not something which is clean and neat. And it's not going to produce something that's perfect. It's not an ideological approach. What's obvious is that, in large part, citizens have walked away from the idea of society, in large part. And that is an act of pessimism and passivity. And that since the days of C.P. Snow, technology has exploded, and we have enormous contradictions between science, the humanities, the social sciences, technology. There are all these categories. I mean, the social sciences, since his day, have actually come to believe that they're sciences. In other words, and actually, they don't actually understand science. I can say this because I'm come out of the social sciences to some extent. They actually believe that because they have facts, they can prove things. Whereas I know a lot of Nobel scientists, and none of them believe that the facts allow them to say they've proved anything. They just think it's part of a process of a discussion that might be going somewhere. Whereas my economist and political science buddies all say, well, I have the facts and here's a chart and I've got it. Really? I could take a whole bunch of other facts and do another chart. So this is all tendentious. So I actually don't think that's where the answers lie. Some of it will be grandiose, but a lot of it has to be not grandiose. And frankly, I think that the universities, in the person of the professors and the students, have an enormous role of leadership to play. That if people see that those of us who by definition belong to the elite, the leadership, or the future leadership, if they see us doing things for which we're not paid, it's not charity, we're not asking for thanks or admiration, we just think it's important to be out there doing these things for society's sake, I think it will send an enormous message and have an enormous impact on other people in society. Often when one's inside universities, it feels like, you're inside, right? Snowwood. I don't actually believe that. I just don't believe that. I don't believe I believe that the fundamental obligation of those of us who have a lot of education or are getting a lot of education is that it's not to go out and tell people what to do, it's to go out and engage ourselves in society and to use what we know. Not necessarily in a lecturing way. I'll give you a little example, and I'm sorry it's a Canadian example. We have a lot of it. We take about 250 immigrants a year. 85% become citizens within 5 years. It works pretty well. There are a lot of flaws and problems, but it works pretty well. There are places that fall through the gaps and don't work. And there's a little program that was started about 15 years ago called Pathways to Education. And it was started in the poorest area in Toronto, where there were people who were second and third generation, really almost like a ghetto, but not of any particular race or religion. It was a failure, a place of failure, if you like, and broken families and so on, and virtually no kids finishing high school. So what they did was, I'm simplifying grossly, but the central element of what they did was they took the unused basement of a church in the area and set up trestle tables and announced that there would be a lot of leaders of society who would be coming to work with the kids on their schoolwork, on their homework. So the first year, 50 kids turned up, really quite sort of what's going on. Grade 9 it started. And they found leading professors, leading lawyers, writers, doctors, who would come in a couple of nights a week, and one table said math, and another table said history, and another said literature. And they'd just sit there, and the kids would come, and they'd work with them on their homework, and they would talk. And 48 out of the 50 went to university. Nobody had gone to university in this area. It's now thousands and thousands of kids. Now, the really interesting thing about it is that the most excited people are the elite. Because when you talk to them, they say, I'd never met any of these immigrant kids. I mean, this is so fabulous, because twice a week I'm hearing all about what they're doing and their families, and I'm actually learning something about my society, which I don't learn about in my office building or in my university. And of course, the kids they're also very excited. I remember being at a Christmas party, and one of the boys, about 16 years old, filled with gonadal energy, kind of coming up to me in a very masculine way. And one of the things they introduced was that if you stayed in it in grade 11 or 12, you could do a university course, which was a really interesting thing to offer to the kids, right? And he came up to me and he sort of went to me, like hitting me on the chest, said, I got a university course. And whereas maybe 10 years before he would have said, I just beat someone up. So it's a little bit what you were asking about. It's about you change the narrative. And now literally thousands of these kids are going to university, and that was done outside the walls of the university, outside the walls of the businesses and the law firms and all the rest of it. And it's really exciting and fun. And I go to things periodically, and I meet kids who graduated 10 years ago, and they come up to me and say, do you remember when we talked about this? It's a form of citizenship. It's a form of friendship. Friendship for people you're not related to except as citizens. And these are very simple things. That's what they were doing in this group I was visiting today. They were essentially sitting down with these street kids and organizing them and, showing them how they can do things and, hoping that would lead to them going into schools. And if they succeed, every kid they succeed with, that'll be a major change for this city, Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Saul. May I request you to remain on the stage just a little while longer? I would like to request Professor Imran Rahman, Vice Chancellor of ULAB, to please come on stage and hand over a memento to John Ralston Saul. Now Professor Imran Rahman, Vice Chancellor of ULAB, will deliver his vote of thanks.
Thank you. And of course, the first vote of thanks goes to our speaker, John Ralston Saul, for such a fascinating and entertaining talk, flawless. And I just thought, sitting there listening to his topics, such a wide range, that so much of it has resonance with our university's mission as a liberal arts school, which is, one of our main missions is to create future citizens with many of these, independent thoughts, freedom of thinking, aptitudes that we'd want them to have. And I do believe that, to a certain extent, Bangladesh is a classic example where the citizens have walked away from society, as you mentioned. We see young people on the roads, protesting on so many issues, but none of the very basic issues regarding their rights as citizens, and the fact that we are not this is not a monarchy, and people in power have been voted by the citizens, and they need to be much more aware of their rights. So thank you so much, John, for this fascinating talk. We are very, very privileged that you've come to ULAB to deliver this. I'd also like to thank Dr. Qazi Anis Ahmed, who had to leave a bit early, for his wonderful introduction and for actually making it possible for John to be here. Dr. Anis, I don't know how he's still on his feet. He's been one of the key organizers of the Hay Festival, which ended yesterday. So he's made up very strong stuff, and I'm just have to find out what that is. I'd like to thank the audience, especially the guests who've braved Dhaka traffic to be here. I'd like to thank the students, those who asked the questions. I'd like to thank our Board of Trustees members, Amina Ahmed, our Professor Emeritus, Professor Rafiq, other professors, heads of departments. Special thanks to Juditha for really doing this such a quick and marvelous event management so this could be possible, and to the team, including our such an adept MC we have here and the communication department. So thank you all very, very much for this wonderful evening. Thank you.